Welcome back to our audience to another installment of the Go AI podcast. We have a special guest today. Would you mind introducing yourself to our audience? Say who you are and who you're with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks, Connor. Thanks, Jenna. And my name's Justin Trombold. I'm at this juncture in my career. I'm the president and founder of a small consulting firm called Antesyn Advisors. That's kind of an annoying way to say we like to work with clients and help them make decisions so they can at least position themselves in the right way before they miss the mark, or they can at least see the miss before it comes. So it's a fancy turn on language saying before you miss the target. And as the president of that company, the majority of our work focuses on enterprise generative AI readiness. That goes all the way from what could be considered a more academic exercise, which is identifying capability gaps in an organization to then know what you can and can't do. And the more positive side of that is what you can do to win today and what you can plan for to win tomorrow. And so that's a core part of our business, but it also ranges to working with, and it could be large organizations or business units as well, but also small businesses in helping upskill um, the individuals that are closest to the work and help leaders get a better sense of how to empower their people and how to identify and scale value creating use cases. So that's what I do now. I'll give a quick blurb. Before, I spent a decade or so with big firm consulting and with various firms doing strategy work. Before that, I was an academic teacher and researcher in biological sciences for about 15 years. So, very different types of fields, but an interesting path to come in. And as generative AI started to hit the market, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, I was a little bit more comfortable than some at changing focus and adapting to change in that way. And so, generative AI has become a core part of our business because it's not only something that's obviously hot off the presses and everyone's talking about it, but it's a unique tool in that in many ways, more than other technology, it touches so many parts of the business and has so many things that have to be true for it to work well. And not just the technology and data. What we really focus on a lot is the people, the ways of working, the culture that goes along with taking something that appears to be out of the box and turning it into something that's value creating.
Justin, some of that is very insightful. Thank you. Some of the best consultants that I've had the pleasure of working with, they ask the best questions. What questions or a question do you see not being asked to small business owners with AI or around AI?
Yeah, that in itself is a good question. So the I'm thinking about the framing of the question they're not asking themselves in the context of what mistake that they're making. And what I would say is the question that they either didn't ask themselves or they're not being honest with what with whether when they answer that question or not is linked back to what I was saying. How ready are your people to operate in a more dynamic, collaborative, and flat culture, right? So what does that mean? That means one of the areas that as we talked about with ways of working needing to be critically aligned for generative AI to create value for organizations. What typically occurs is that people will chase whatever technology or what's the latest update in generative AI, or they hear about a use case or some company or vendor that's developing something,
Shiny
and
objects.
they'll put it in front of their people. Now, that works if you're talking about like a fancier email system, or you're talking about, this is maybe not quite so true, but a typical software as a solution where you plug it in and it kind of operates itself in some respects. What's different about generative AI, and it's largely governed by the IT team. What's different about generative AI is it might still be governed by the IT team in the nuts and bolts, but the operation of it is so critically dependent on the people that are using the tool. It's
Mhm.
also very expensive to deploy it, and it creeps, right? So a lot of IT solutions don't creep the same way that generative AI does. So you can deploy solutions that not only confuse your people and will have them spend time doing things they perhaps shouldn't be doing or creating content they shouldn't be creating and having a net drag. It also is very, very expensive. And in many cases, the leaders aren't ready for the massive information that it's going to generate. And so, long story short, how ready are you to operate in this environment where information is plentiful, but resources are still scarce? The operation of it is more dependent on the people at the organization than the IT department. And so there's a balancing act there. And I think what we see is organizations that either naturally have a more agile or more collaborative working style, or perhaps have had success deploying AI solutions or other solutions like that, are set up for success. And the organizations that aren't need to take a very intentional and honest look at themselves to say, where are we? Where do we need to be? What can we do? What can we not do? And taking that first step.
There's a white paper that can be found on your website about Gen-AI readiness, and two of the key characteristics that were brought up in that about Gen-AI readiness was experimentation, a willingness to experiment, and adaptability and scalability, somewhat interchangeable there. Could you go deeper into those about how you can reach AI maturity with those two characteristics?
Yeah, and I love the way you said that because it feels to me, and feel free to chime in on this, that experimentation has almost become the word of failure in generative AI. So you see some of the papers out there, it's like 95% are failing in the experimental phase. And I would say just one thing I want to comment on that is that, yeah, that's a big number, but it's not entirely clear if that's a good or a bad thing, right? So what makes it a good or a bad thing? Well, what makes it a bad thing is that if there is a significant amount of capital investment or other resource investment in developing the tools to support that experiment, and then it didn't pan out, right? So experimentation is critical as a first step. Now, the second part you talked about scalability and adaptability, and in simple terms, or a way to parse that out is that scalability is the result of being adaptable, right? So they're interchangeable in some ways, but one is an outcome and the other one is what needs to be true for the scaling to occur. And in this context, scaling is taking those, let's even go back before experiments. It's taking those ideas and it's putting them into a position in which they're creating value. So that doesn't have to mean scaled across the whole organization. That doesn't have to mean scaled across an entire process or an entire, function. It just means that you're taking something that is an idea and then you're testing it and then it's in a position where it's creating value. And that could be a massive scale, but it doesn't have to be. Specifically to your question, Connor, of what has to be true for that to work well. It's somewhat of a, I don't want to get too hung up into the operating model details of what has to be true to make that happen. But if we think about generative AI in two buckets, of what it can do, the first thing it can do is it can help make better decisions or perhaps more informed decisions. What
Mhm.
it also can do is it can augment processes. It can have an efficiency driver and so forth. I'll focus on the latter bucket when I'm talking about what that looks like to be able to scale, because the decision part's a little bit more complicated. But in terms of improving those two areas, the key steps are first, let's make a concerted decision as an organization that we're going to embrace generative AI as an opportunity rather than a threat. Now, this might be some of that like positive self-talk. You have to say it before you can really believe it, and maybe not everyone has to believe it. And Jenna, were you going to add something
Uh,
there?
well, I thought in order for, yeah, you have to have some belief in order to, what I'm hearing is have organizational change in order to change
Yeah.
behavior, right? If you're own organization, you have to look in the mirror, right? And so mirroring. So to me, I'm like, all of this is kind of full circle. So of course you need to kind of positive think, if you want to say that, your way into change. It's just a different perspective. You can say positive, but you could also say it's just looking at it differently.
Well, and I think as yeah, we'll stay. I'll force myself to stay on this path here, but this just brings up a lot of interesting ideas that, in some ways, I think our mind naturally goes to the threat exists for the doers and not the senior individuals, not the leaders. But what we see a lot, and what we think is going to start to unfold, is that generative AI is actually going to be a very brutal leadership test, meaning that the leaders that are able to do some of these difficult things that I'm going to describe here in a moment, which essentially boil down to operating model changes, which is change management, that's transformation. A rare leader. That's very hard to do. It's why there are consultants, and it's why even with consultants, it's very hard to do, if not harder to do in many cases. But so it's a leadership test as much as it's a test for the people that are doing the work itself. And so that first idea of setting the mindset, this is an opportunity, this isn't a threat. Then the next hurdle to tackle is that hurdle where you need to get your people to where they can think in generative AI terms. And so what do I mean by that? The corollary is, what does it look like when you do a really good job working with a peer or working with someone that works underneath you, and you do a really good job mentoring them and a really good job directing them to, do certain things, train them, give them tasks, and so
Coach.
forth. Generative AI is the same thought process, but it's using a different type of tool sets. It's how do you query these systems? And even if you're not using an LLM, if you're using an application, it's still a similar thought process. How do you query these systems in a unique and often complicated way to get it to do the work that you want it to do, and to do it effectively, efficiently, and repeatably, right? So how do you, when you're faced with a problem or opportunity, how are you able to think about ways to solve it using generative AI the same way you would direct someone or collaborate with somebody on a project? So there's a natural comfort. So let's just call that generative AI training. So getting your people up to speed on what to do, what not to do. We like to start with the basics of saying, let's learn how to write good prompts. Let's learn how to direct the models so they pull the information that you trust, and the information that's good and reliable. So let's say that foundation is set up. So why is that foundation so important? It isn't that prompt engineering per se is important, or knowing how to attach documents is important. It's that what you need to have is a culture where your people are examining the work that they're doing, or the work that they could be doing, and they're dynamically looking for solutions. So they're out there and they're able to go in and start testing, and they're able to start piloting. Now, two things have to be true for that to work. First, you have to, and this is the first pillar in our white paper, you have to have a clearly defined generative AI strategy that aligns to your enterprise or business unit or some objective, whatever level you want to put that at. So what that does is it tells your people, here are the four walls of the sandbox you're going to play in. We're not going to mess around with use cases over here or there. Stay in this general lane. That can be across any number of parameters. We want to focus on process optimization. We don't want to focus on, decision support. You can set those guardrails and be clear about it. You also need to tell them which tools they can play with. So what toys are in the sandbox, right? And make that very clear. So you set those guardrails. To make the experimentation work, then there has to be a clear way that your people, assuming they now know how to use the tools, they can experiment and they can track those experiments. They know how to dissect their work. They know how to go in and document whether it's improving that workflow or improving whatever they're trying to improve. And that communication needs to be very clear of how that scales up. And that leads to a cascade of questions that say, okay, we've we've identified the workflows where there are opportunities, either a problem to solve or some gain to be made. Then you think within that process, what could change, what could be improved if you inserted generative AI within that? Then you say, okay, well, what does that look like? And now the next steps become, okay, we've identified some areas, we've shown that they work. Now it's a question of should this scale, right? And scaling could be as simple as you're taking something that you're currently doing manually with a series of prompts in an LLM, under an enterprise license, and you're gold plating it, right? You're working with a vendor to set up an agentic workflow, or you're finding an out-of-the-box solution that could fit that criteria. Whatever, there's a series of decisions that go with that. But that could also be, okay, we've done this chunk of the workflow, and I'm one of 5 people on the team. We want all 5 people to do it. So the
Mhm.
scaling becomes a training activity. Or it could be we've done this chunk, and now we want to do end to end, right? So you can see how these decisions start to come together. But ultimately, the decision for leaders is making sure that you're getting those inputs from your people, you're getting the type of inputs you want, you're getting the type of information that you need to then make those decisions, yes or no, invest, and then where to invest.
Very good. I have a direct quote actually from the white paper that I would like to
Oh, I
read
say
because
a lot of things. Let's see. Let's see if
You're like, oh boy.
actually, because I really like this. I liked it so much I had to write it down. This is part of a larger passage, but it says organizations should focus on core capabilities that establish a way of working that enables Gen AI, not vice versa. And to me, I think that connects back to what you were saying about envisioning how your way of working can have Gen AI fit into it, rather than looking at the Gen AI and going like, okay, how do we start from the Gen AI? It's
yeah.
I
I
really like
couldn't have
that
said it
quote.
better myself. So thank you for thank you for tying a bow on that, because that I think captures that concept of, many of your listeners, and I think you all appreciate this as well, that, what makes a business decision good? Is it when you start with something that I'm really excited about this technology, or I'm really excited about going into this market or this product that we have? Or is it there is this burning need that needs to be filled that's currently unmet, right? That's kind of like the classic, gap analysis that you do as a consultant or a leader or in your life or whatever context. Generative AI is like that, but on steroids. It magnifies the mistakes because it's expensive, and there's a much greater opportunity cost if you're missing those opportunities that could be there, but you're starting with the tool rather than the problem or the opportunity.
Which is why, yeah, start with the problem. And so we could go obviously a whole day into that. When you're working with leaders, Justin, and again, looking when they get to that point where they pause and they look at their team or their leadership team and they say, oh my gosh, I actually don't have a leadership team full of maybe solution
Mm,
oriented thinkers or critical thinkers right now.
mhm.
What are you seeing leaders when I'm sure they are in that stage of recognition, which is great, right? But I'm sure they're also recognizing, well, there's problems that come along with that. There's
Yep.
holes, right,
Mhm.
that now need plugged based on that recognition.
Yeah. I wish I had a great answer to you, but I think for that question, but I think I do, because there isn't a great answer to that question. And I'll give an example to show you what I mean. So I'm currently working with a small organization. It's about 15 to 20 people. It's a family office that does, investments and asset management and so forth. And there's probably about 1.5 to 2.5 people that not just get it and get what generative AI is, but are actually willing to get their hands dirty and get in there. Now, that's a flat enough organization that everybody's kind of a leader in their own way. So it's a bit unique. But to your question of, well, what do you do if you look across the company and say that 80 to 90% of people aren't there. They
Aren't
they
fit.
either yeah, they either don't have it or they don't have call it a curiosity spark. They don't have that ability to critically think, to um, use generative AI as this analytical sidekick, and not only find the solutions, but then
Ask the
maybe more
question.
importantly, adjust their behavior once they find it. What can you do with that extra 20% of time, which is a tougher
Exactly, which
question
is
than people
nice.
think.
Yep.
Well, yeah. So the best answer that we have so far, at least from my experience, is you have to leverage those people the best you can. And the way that we do that is it could manifest in two different ways. For a smaller organization like that, they become your champions. They become a tiger team, so to speak, or whatever you want, a red team or whatever you want to call it, that you essentially turn them loose and they start experimenting not only in their own areas, but perhaps in other. We're having them think about their own processes, but also help others go through that process of thinking about what they do and how they can augment it and start testing those solutions. In larger organizations, it usually can be spread out, that you can find a handful of people that have that capability that sit in each business unit or in most groups. You can find those champions. So you have to find those champions. And what we haven't quite figured out yet, or I haven't, and I know organizations are talking about this, is what do you do to incentivize those individuals without making it feel like everybody else is left behind? That's a bit of an open question that I would say your listeners can think about, because it's going to be different in most companies. But the tougher question, the one that I don't have an answer for, Jenna, and what you said is, as a leader, what do you do, or should you do anything if you have people that are not just more senior, but are on, let's say they're on the leadership track, they have a lot of other really good qualities, but it appears as though they can't operate well in this generative AI world?
Hmm.
It's a really tough question because we don't know exactly what the world's going to look like yet. So I would say the simplest answer is you empower the people that can, you don't punish the people that can't yet, and you
Oh, I
create
love
an
that.
environment. Yeah, you create an environment where the business doesn't fall behind. So you don't do nothing because one group can't perhaps keep up. And I think at this stage, I think you want to be really careful with overreacting, and whether it's through headcount reductions or it's demotion, whatever it might be. And not because you shouldn't ever consider that. It's just there are a lot of unknowns right now, and you often don't know where some of that expertise is. And so perhaps over time that there can be more structured ways that businesses look at, how do you upskill your people, not just to be the doer in generative AI, but are there roles to play of someone being in more of an advisory role as like a,
Mhm.
a, a sidekick that's making sure the right questions are being asked and answered. Because the skill sets probably interplay much like they do today. It may not be one person that has all the skills that are needed. And so it's to come back around and wrap it up, find the champions, make tiger teams, deploy that process similar to what we talked about, and start to get creative about how you integrate people in different ways surrounding the generative AI processes. And then, if you have to make tough decisions, then you can make those tough decisions. But I would be hesitant to jump to just focusing on the people that are competent and enthusiastic about generative AI, because you risk losing a lot of really key institutional knowledge, not to mention the change management challenges that could come if people are starting to see that anybody that isn't generative AI savvy is getting very clearly left behind. And so I don't have a great answer. There are a lot of things I could talk about to consider, but that's about as far as I think we are right now.
Yeah, well, and Justin, I don't have the answers either. I just appreciate being in an environment where we're open and can talk about it. I think Vistage released a study where it's just the most uncertainty, right now that
Mhm.
CEOs are facing nationwide. And so, in these environments that are uncertain, when you're asking your people to make a lot of changes, what I'm hearing you say is I loved that, empower the people that are, but don't punish the people that aren't, because just think about yourself as a human and how much of a challenge it is just to, on a daily basis, make small changes every day, consistently, repeatedly, so that they stick. These are big changes. And especially when you're thinking about new language that you're putting to operations and new technology, new behaviors, it's a lot. So
Yeah.
I love that, that phrase. I love that.
I would challenge those people that aren't that they're intimidated to, let's say, engage with the solution. I one question you can ask your teams, and you can talk to individuals like that, is give some thought and find out a way to engage in some way, right? So whether that's engaging with those champions and just seeing what they're doing, seeing what the art of the possible is, right?
Mm,
Because some of these individuals could be great idea people, but they're getting held up by that uncertainty of the process. So if we reflect on all the things that I talked about in terms of Connor's great question of, well, what can you do to set up an experimentation and a scalability and adaptability culture? All of those things, if you boil them down, are about decreasing uncertainty, right? So it's saying, set the walls of the sandbox, give them the toys, make it clear if things work or they don't, make it clear how investment decisions are being made. These are all things that, for both the end users all the way up to leadership, reduce uncertainty. And when you reduce uncertainty, even though maybe you constrained a little bit, people paradoxically, or this, I guess it's
they feel
become a
safe.
bit, yeah, it's become a bit of a cliche to call it paradoxical at this point, but you feel a sense of freedom when
Mhm,
you sort of know where those guardrails are. And so that if you can do that, I think what will end up happening, and this is just a guess at this point, because I haven't seen it, we haven't had enough time for it to play out yet. I think some of these late adopters, some of these resistors might end up being more valuable than originally thought once you
mhm.
start to reduce uncertainties in their environment and how they're thinking about those solutions.
Mhm.
Excellent point to end on. If our listeners want to hear any more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, podcasts like this, so subscribe, listen to this podcast. But yeah, we have what I think is a really interesting generative AI diagnostic that informed the research that Connor was talking about in the white paper. We have a quick 6 or 7 question version of that on our website, and I'll share the link with Connor and Jenna, and we'll see if they can post it in the show notes. But you can just go in there and, yeah, play around with it. I won't say read the white paper. You can if you want. I don't want to put anybody through that if they're not interested. But take those questions, give some thoughts. If you provide our information through that portal, we'd love to connect with you and continue the discussion.
We will certainly put Justin's website and socials in the show notes. So, Justin, thank you for being on the Go AI podcast. And listeners, we look forward to the next one.
Thanks for coming on, Justin.
Bye.
Thank you so much.